Thank you very much, Prof. Kirsty. My name is Nehemiah Latola. I am a current PhD candidate in the Faculty of Science at the institution, and it's such an honor and a privilege to be moderating the session. As Prof has stated, our speaker this afternoon is Prof. Karin van Marle, who will be talking to us on the topic of democracy and the city. Just a few house rules before I introduce Prof. Prof will be speaking for 45 minutes, whereafter we will have a 30-minute engagement of question and answer. You will notice on your screen there is a Q&A portion. Feel free to populate that section during the talk with any questions, and I will then lead Prof through that exercise after her discussion. So without further ado, as an introduction, Prof. Karin van Marle joined the Department of Public Law at the University of the Free State in February 2019. Before joining the UFS, she worked as a professor in the Department of Jurisprudence at the University of Pretoria. She's an ethical feminist, and her research and writing are inspired by and embedded in feminist theory. Her research falls within a broad field of law and humanities and involve critical theory, legal philosophies, and jurisprudence. Her work on post-1994 jurisprudence engages with the crisis of modernity and a rethinking of law and legal theory along the lines of fragility, finitude, and a giving up of certitudes. She has published widely in national and international journals and books, and serves on the International Editorial Board of Law and Critique and the International Advisory Board of Feminist Legal Studies and Legalities. She's an adjunct professor at the University of South Cross University in Australia, and a fellow at Stellenbosch Institute for Advanced Studies. So without further ado, Prof, over to you.
Thank you very much. I sent a slide. I don't know if you've received it. It's not crucial. There was just a painting that I wanted to show. Yes, just the next one. It's only one slide. So yes, thank you so much. All right. So the title of my paper then, Democracy and the City. Gillian Rose, in a work titled Mourning Becomes the Law, the philosophical counterpart to her memoir Love's Work, engages with the painting by Nicolas Poisson, The Ashes of Foikion, collected by his widow. Foikion was an Athenian general and statesman with outstanding virtue in his public and private life, who was accused of treason by his enemies and sentenced to death. His burial within Athens was forbidden, and his body was taken outside of the city and burned. The painting that you should be seeing now shows the wife of Foikion with a woman companion gathering his ashes. Now, Gillian Rose was a certain reading of this painting that regards the act of the women as an act of perfect love, portraying the so-called New Jerusalem. And this act is then contrasted to Athens in the back of the painting, that according to this reading represents the unjust nature of the city. For Rose, this opposition of redeeming life to the implacable domination of architectural and political order completely affects the politics of this painting. She reminds us that Foikion's condemnation and death were caused by tyranny that usurped good rule in the city. And she reads the acts of the women as political defiance and political risk. The act of the women is not solely one of infinite love, she says, but rather a finite act of political justice. For Rose, the women, by gathering ashes, are protesting against arbitrary power, not power and law as such. To see the city in the background as unjust, she says, perpetuates endless dying and endless tyranny. So you can actually stop the slide now. Thank you. I would like to thank Christy van der Westhuizen, Alan Zinn, Andre Kiet, Pamela Maseko, and all others involved in organizing the conference, for the kind invitation, Professors Mamdani and Gumede and all other speakers so far for much needed reflection and deliberation of the state we're in. And thanks, Nehemiah, for moderating. So in the time available, I want to reflect firstly on the way in which aesthetic tropes have been relied on in engagements with constitutional democracy. Secondly, on the idea of city life as the being together of strangers. And then thirdly, on notions of inoperativity, inclination, and fabulation as ways through which we can engage and return to the city, although it may fail. So I start by recalling a few thoughts on transformation, after which I return then to the reliance on ethics, city life, and the return to the city. So Shoshana Fellman and Dori Laub's work on literary texts and their interaction with history, which go beyond tracing, mere representation and reflection, but insists also on reinscription, translation, and radically rethinking, serves as an inspiration for my reflection. And the following remark by Fellman and Laub struck me. They say, in order to gain insight into the significance and impact of the context of the text, the empirical context need not just to be known, but also to be read. And they propose to show how the basic and legitimate critical demand for contextualization of the text itself needs to be complemented simultaneously by the less familiar and yet necessary work of textualization of the context. So the reliance on aesthetic examples and also city life and their possible value for the theme of democracy is considered in light of this tension between textualization and contextualization. I explore whether cultural theory and the invocation of aesthetics could assist in engaging the historical and present context in both ways. In other words, so that it can be known and read. Relying also on work on nostalgia, I explore this further in order to argue that aesthetics can assist us to confront the crisis of modernity, maybe for my purposes in particular legal modernity, and disclose ways to engage and reconcile with the finitude and the fragility of the world. So firstly, transformation. The thread running through South African history, as we all know, is one of colonialism, coloniality, apartheid, and with it racial domination and exclusion. And space and time do not allow a detailed expansion. It's also not necessary. We know the story. Suffice to say that the history, which to a great extent reflects also the present of South Africa, can be described as one of political and economic hegemony and systemic exploitation and inequality. Many commentators agree that the future of the country depends to a great extent on how we remember its past, and I want to add how we tell the present. So what are the main shifts that were envisioned, and to what extent have they been successful? One way in which the shift has been regarded, of course, has been that of a legal revolution because of the centrality of law in the shift from parliamentary sovereignty to constitutional supremacy. The adoption of constitutional supremacy came then with another shift, the shift from a culture of authoritarianism to one of justification. And on a jurisprudential level, the hope was that we can leave a pervasive positive approach to law and legal interpretation behind in favor of approaches that could embrace indeterminacy, democratic deliberation, and values. Priscilla Cornell has invoked Hans Kelsen's notion of a substantive revolution to describe the change that occurred with the adoption of constitutionalism. Drawing on Justice Ackerman, she concedes that, and I quote, the revolution in South Africa was not a full Kelsenian revolution, in that it did not simply end all of the reigning institutions of the judicial order, but it was a revolution in that law and the principle of legality itself come to be grounded in the Constitution. Drawing on Immanuel Kant, Cornell contends that the South African Constitution appeals to an ideal community over and above being grounded on shared norms. This ideal community does not only legally constitute a new South Africa, but points to an ethical realm that has never existed and will certainly never exist in some kind of institutional form. Cornell is clear about the fact that the present constitution has moved away from the norms that made a system of apartheid possible and thus regards the constitution as emblematic of the very revolution that took place. She regards this revolution as one that gives life to the spirit of transformation. The spirit of transformation of the realms of external freedom as it is legalized, but never in a final sense, so that it remains grounded in the ideal of a self-legislating community that is always aspirational and not merely a social fact. So, of course, the struggle for transformation continues, and we've experienced protest on many levels by various members of society. And maybe important to mention that calls for transformation, albeit most urgent for socioeconomic change, include the struggle for epistemic justice, for spatial justice. Let me turn to aesthetics. The more than 2 decades after the shift from parliamentary sovereignty to constitutional supremacy have seen many engagements with literature, art, music, and other symbols and forms in an attempt to make sense of the anticipated change in the face of endurance. This has been described, for example, as an aesthetic turn or also an aesthetic mode of coping. Constitutional discourse has relied, amongst others, on, for example, the notions of the bridge, the book, the monument, the memorial, and also drawing, in attempts to unearth new and alternative ways to think about, to talk about, to theorize the multiple facets of the struggle to transform. Constitution has also been described as historically self-conscious. So reflections on memory, of course, accompany constitutional discourse and theory. So a number of aesthetic examples have been employed in an attempt to engage with this daunting task of transforming. Wessel Leroux notes that the extent to which constitutional discourse engages with aesthetic example describes an aesthetic turn that occurred in the early 1990s. And he negates the view that this was really just part of a postmodernist academic fad. And he argues that the way in which aesthetics and very specific artworks have been invoked could be seen as a very specific attempt to counter formalist approaches to the Constitution, and I add classical liberal approaches to the notion of democracy. Leroux recalls the attempts in the early 1990s of mainly legal scholars, but also others, to restore legal scientific approaches to law. Initially, an outright rejection of the idea of constitutional rights, to later on a call for a restriction on how constitutional rights could change the common law, and to eventually the suggestion that constitutional rights be approached and conceived in terms of subjective rights. Leroux refers to this as a private law invasion of constitutional law. He draws on the work of Van der Walt that set the path for a different reading and application of constitutional rights, namely that of a public or a non-privatized constitutional rights discourse. And for Leroux, the turn to aesthetics should be seen as an attempt to resist legal formalism and to disclose a substantive rights discourse that supports the understanding of rights as the medium of an ongoing dialogue in the public. Leroux mentions a number of engagements. For example, storytelling was invoked as a way to explain the workings of the limitations clause in the Constitution, based on the argument that logic or science will not be helpful in this kind of analysis, but rather the great novels of world literature. Music, in particular jazz, stood in as the model to be followed by an open community of interpreters whose task it is to bring the Constitution to life. In the realms of visual art, sculptures were relied on to support a multicultural interpretation of constitutional rights. And he notes the extent to which much of the reliance on aesthetic examples stand in the service of a certain celebration of the openness and the plurality of constitutional meaning. Storytelling, music, art have been used to support this idea of a substantive constitutionalism, and with it the support of an active public in which dialogue and deliberation can take place. And this has gone hand in hand, of course, also with the recreation of public space. So briefly, I think we should note the extent to which there was an engagement with public spaces, museums, monuments, and memorials since the mid-1990s. And of course, also on an international level, curators committed themselves to the aim of making public participation central to the establishment of these museums. And also in the South African context, we had many discussions about museums and public spaces and so on. Importantly here, the TRC and the public nature of its workings and the role that played. Anne Coombs, art historian, for example, notes at least two ways in which public history came to the fore. Namely, firstly, by attempts to create new national histories, but also then by paying attention to individual stories. And museums were confronted with the task of this kind of mediation. So the role that public space, monuments, memorials, but also street names can play in the creation of a participatory democracy and active citizenship has been central in the post-1994 discourse. And of course, since 2015, the question of statues with the Rose Must Fall protests became even more prominent. So as I've noticed, a number of aesthetic tropes have been employed. Maybe one of the earliest symbols already in the epilogue of the 1994 Constitution was that of the bridge. The idea of a bridge as a symbol for the Constitution and the change it can bring was embraced in quite optimistic fashion by some constitutional scholars to argue how we can leave a certain past behind. But of course, a more sober take on the image of the bridge was that the bridge, as much as it can bring things forward, can also take them back. And of course, it can also bring stagnation. So at the same time, it was argued that more attention should also be paid to the abyss that lies underneath the bridge. And these two different readings of the bridge, to a certain extent, relate, but also underscore the on the way in which the use of aesthetics could be interpreted in the tradition of Kantian philosophy and Lyotard's invocation of the different. Without going into detail, the difference between aesthetic judgment and judgments of science or morality is that the former is reflexive and the latter two determinant in nature. I quote, "Aesthetic judgments require not the impersonal operation of logic, but rather an imaginative and self-corrective dialogue with others, otherness and difference. This kind of reflexive judgment relies on a plurality of viewpoints, is open to dialogue, and resists the temptation of formalism or closure. So it's understandable why scholars turn to aesthetics and specifically aesthetic judgment as a way to support ideas of plurality and substantive public rationality." Leroux refers to this, he says, "This is all we have to save us from constitutional kitsch." But at the same time, the extent to which constitutional rights can be explained by way of the Kantian model of reflexive judgment should also be questioned. And Leroux does this by invoking Lyotard's invocation of the different, by which art is not invoked to redeem modernity, but rather to deepen the crisis. And he refers here to how the drawings of William Kentridge have been relied on as a way to explain the limits of the law as a vessel for political action and also for the potential to respond fully to the other. And I contend that in the extent to which this reliance stand in the tradition of Kant's aesthetic judgments and Lyotard's different, it also relates to what Feldman and Loeb invoke as knowing and reading. So the exposure of the limits of constitutional transformation, including the idea of substantive constitutionalism, is a way of reading and not merely knowing. So memory has played a central role in the reconfiguring of South African society. Many people will argue that it's inscribed in the constitutional text itself. Carl Clare, for example, refers to the historical self-consciousness of the Constitution and how this is linked then to a certain theoretical reading of the Constitution and then the resistance to treat memory as one-dimensional. Maybe two specific metaphors that were relied on in an attempt to make sense of the transformative potential of the Constitution by invoking memory are those of the monument and the memorial. And Lawrence du Plessis, the late Lawrence du Plessis, who sadly passed earlier this year, in describing the Constitution in terms of monument and memorial, was influenced by South African philosopher Johan Snyman, who, drawing on examples from post-war Germany, has made a distinction between these two ways of remembering the monument and the memorial. So the monument celebrates in grand fashion, where the memorial remembers and mourns the losses and the victims of war struggle. And the 1994 and 1996 constitutions both illustrate monumental and memorial moments. We have there what du Plessis refers to as hardly modest claims, the achievement of peaceful transition, non-racial democracy, and so on, but dignity, equality, freedom. As he says, these are examples of monumental flair. But at the same time, these texts also carry the traces of modesty and impossibility. And of course, Snyman and du Plessis then opened ways for legal scholars to take this further, to argue for a memorial constitutionalism or a counter-monumental constitutionalism. So in the vein of this, there was also specific attention paid to the site and the building of the Constitutional Court itself. As we know, the court was built on the site of the old fort, where various prisoners, included political opponents of the apartheid regime through the years, were held. And the site itself reveals a rich history that encapsulates multiple memories. And Leroux, in a volume on post-apartheid law and critique, reflects on the court building as an architectural expression of this notion of transformative constitutionalism. And he suggests then this notion of a labyrinth, in addition to the more cleaner, optimistic metaphor of the bridge. So he also underscores the memorial aspects of the Constitution and the limits of a constitutional transformation and substantive constitutionalism to create a truly reflexive public and to respond to those who continue to be excluded. And he recalls the story by Franz Kafka, Before the Law, but specifically how it's read by Jacques Derrida. In the fable, Before the Law, a man comes from the country. He arrives at the building where the court is located. The building has many gates, and each visitor has a special gate just for him or her or them to enter. But these gates are guarded by a security officer, and a gatekeeper then tells this man that he cannot enter yet. He should wait. When the man peeps through the gate, he sees inside the building a network of more gates, a labyrinth network of gates and hallways, and each of them guarded by a gatekeeper. This man waits his whole life, and at the end of his life, when he passes away, the gate is shut, so the door of the law never opens for him. And for Leroux, Derrida's reading and his description of the quasi-transcendental conditions of law should be heeded. To quote, the condition of the normative possibility of law is the impossibility of ever gaining final access to the norms of the law. Respect for the law in this vein means to acknowledge that it can never be under total human control. Law's possibility hangs on the impossibility of grasping its origin and its place. To quote, for law to be law, law must become fictional or mystical. But very importantly, this does not mean that law is disembodied or empty. It is, however, a place of constant dislocation. The discourse of the law does not say no, but it says indefinitely, not yet. So turning to the architecture of the court, Leroux then argues that the foyer of the building does not only symbolize a clearing in a forest for a post-apartheid community to gather. Of course, we know the logo of the court is Justice Under the Tree, but it could also be read as the monumental, and that's this idea of Justice Under the Tree can be read as the monumental feature of the building. However, the site of the court, that is also, as we've said, a rehabilitated prison, carries the traces and the memories of the trauma and the exclusion of the past. And Leroux describes that in the foyer of the court, amongst the pillars of the court symbolizing the trees, the forest, we also find the original staircase of the awaiting trial prison. And this staircase for him holds multiple meanings. It could serve as a reminder of a time that should never be repeated, but at the same time, it also underscores the impossibility of making clear distinctions between past, present, and future, and confronts one with the possible continuance of past justice. South African artist Judith Mason's blue dress that is on display in the art gallery of the court is another example that symbolizes both past and present violence, psychic, traumatic, and material against women, but beyond women, also against all vulnerable people who live precarious lives on the margins and the centers of society. I want to turn to drawing, and particularly the drawing technique of South African artist William Kentridge, as an example of textualization of context that also displays indeterminacy and continuous repetition. Kentridge makes use of a technique of drawing and erasure that ultimately produces a layered text that holds many traces. And Leroux suggests that the drawings by Kentridge serve as an appeal to understand constitutional rights, and maybe then also constitutionalism and constitutional democracy, and its aspiration to transform as an activity of drawing. Hélène Cixous, writing on the state of drawingness, is invoked, by which she declares her attraction to works of literature and art that capture arrival and withdrawing simultaneously. Leroux quotes Cixous. She says, "It's not a question of drawing the contours, but what escape the contour. The secret movement, the breaking, the torment, the unexpected." The practice of drawing is understood here as a state of drawingness relates also to two other significant philosophical interventions. Firstly, Levinas's notion of otherness that can never be recognized or captured. And then, of course, secondly, Kant's description of the sublime. For Leroux, both of these interventions underscore the failure of constitutionalism to respond to the other or to create truly representative space. The aesthetic examples discussed here all engage with the notion of transformation, constitutionalism, constitutional democracy. For me, the invocations of aesthetic and cultural tropes do not stand in the guise of celebration, but rather of contingency and complexity. So conclude this section with a brief reference to the work of Hannah Arendt, and in particular her call for us to accept our finitude and to reconcile with the world. Roger Berkowitz recalls George Kateb's reading of Arendt that places reconciliation at the center of her work. Hannah Arendt stood critical towards the modern desire to flee our finite fragility and contingency, and to seek certainty, consistency, and perfection. So reconciliation in this sense means to reconcile with the world as it is. And that counters totalitarianism, and with it, its worldlessness and rootlessness that for her originate in the search for an escape from the human condition. And aesthetics, I argue, could support this kind of engagement with the world, with law, legal theory, democracy, by underscoring finitude, indeterminacy, and the imagination of different and possibly better futures. So the struggle for transformation should take place on many levels, and its possible success relies on the possibility of holding on to multiple approaches. One master narrative and a one-dimensional take on the truth will not only stifle the discourse on transformation, but could even thwart real change. The use of aesthetics and cultural theory, if not employed with the aim of redemption or restoration, but in the vein of continuous reflection and in a state of drawingness, could maybe disrupt such attempts. Let me turn to city life. In the debates between liberals and communitarians, Iris Marion Young famously argued for city life as alternative. And she set up city life as a normative ideal, as the being together of strangers. In terms of democracy, the city as a symbol or a model represents belonging without unity and supports social differentiation without exclusion. supports variety and eroticism that allow unassimilated otherness and relations that are heterogeneous, plural, and playful. Borders in the city are always undecidable, overlapping and mingling. An important insight that Young provides is a distinction between empowerment and autonomy. So she supports, for example, democratization that is distinct from the idea of decentralization of small units of control. Because at the heart of empowerment is publicity, not privacy. So again, you can see how this relates to also what I earlier referred to as the shift to substantive constitutionalism that places the public at the center, and that's the interest here in the city. Even though we might find Young slightly over-optimistic about the potential of the city. But for her, city life holds the possibility of aesthetic inexhaustibility. Svetlana Boym, in a work titled The Future of Nostalgia, reflects on the city and how it becomes an alternative cosmos for collective identification, recovery of other temporalities, and also reinvention of tradition. The city offers for her an alternative in the opposition between global and local culture, namely that of local cosmopolitanism based on face-to-face cross-cultural encounters of strangers. Again, we see the notion of strangers in a physical space. She notes how in some cases, for example, Prague or St. Petersburg, urban cosmopolitanism is not a feature of the present, but rather an element of nostalgia. Drawing on Richard Sennett, she notes that the city is an ideal cross between longing and estrangement, memory and freedom, nostalgia and modernity. The past, and I would add also the presence of the city, is never entirely legible. It is irreducible to any anachronistic language. It suggests other dimensions of lived experience and haunts the city like a ghost. Walter Benjamin described Naples as porous, meaning that nothing is concluded. How he noted buildings in progress standing next to buildings in ruins. So like Kentridge's drawings, and also this idea of the palimpsest that has been invoked often, porosity reflects the layers of time and history, social problems, and techniques of urban survival. The distinction between intentional and unintentional memorials is invoked and combined here with another distinction, namely restorative and reflective nostalgia. Restorative nostalgia is aimed at restoring a home or tradition that was lost in an attempt to protect an absolute truth. Where reflective nostalgia is focused more on the longing itself, it explores multiple ways of living, places and times. It presents an ethical and creative challenge. And of course, this reminds us also of the distinction between a monument and a memorial. And of course, these distinctions are not watertight. And the underlying issue is that of continuous transformation. Of significance for our contemplation on democracy is Boehm's identification of what she calls the off-modern, namely a critical reflection that stands critical towards the new and the old. She explains that in the off-modern tradition, reflection and longing, estrangement and affection go together. And for me, this idea of the off-modern relates to Gillian Rose, the scholar I invoked in the beginning of my talk, and her notion of the broken middle, which she describes as a space of anxiety and equivocation for which there's low tolerance in the modern world. So closer to home, Sarah Nato and Achille Mbembe, of course, invoke Johannesburg as the symbol par excellence of the African modern. They underscore the way in which worldliness comes to the fore in the city and support the complex reading that underscores, again, its artistic and aesthetic elements. And they identify three ways in which South African historiography approaches the city. Firstly, by focusing on spatial dislocation, class differentiation, and racial polarization, the city is perceived as merely a space of planning, and not as an aesthetic project. Secondly, focus on institutional governance, de-racialization, and service provision perceives the city as nothing but a problem to be solved, and then, of course, solutions are prescribed to the exclusion of any engagement with cityness as such. And the third way is concerned with the spatial restructuring of the city, negating the underlying complexities. And I've previously named these approaches also as approaches similar to approaches in law and legal theory that fail to disclose critical and imaginative ways. And I want to argue here that these three approaches they mention, that they would also fail to truly get to the kind of maybe thinking about democracy, constitutional democracy that we want to get at. So let me end with my section on refusal. And I turn to Bonnie Hornick's latest work titled A Feminist Politics of Refusal. Hornick takes the Greek tragedy by Euripides on the Bacchae as starting point. Refusal occurs in three moves in this tragedy. Firstly, women refuse to work in the city, where after they move outside the city to live otherwise, before they return to the city with certain demands. And she reads these acts as a single arc of refusal, which conveys a normative, civic, and feminist obligation to risk the impurities of politics on behalf of transformation. For her, the return to the city is central to a feminist politics of refusal, even though the return may fail. The city for Hornick symbolizes political community and, for our purposes today, also democracy or constitutional democracy. The insistence on the return to the city could open spaces for critical reflection and engagement with it. Hornick concedes that her suggestion might not be useful to everyone, and specifically, she refers to some areas in Black studies who regard the city as unsalvageable. But she says that even those scholars may find something useful in the agonism that she finds in the Bacchae, and I suggest this in the same vein. I should note that refusal has been considered also earlier here as a strategy for critical constitutional scholarship. Drawing on Adriana Cavarero's work on Penelope's weaving and unweaving, as well as the laughter of the women of Trake, I explored refusal as a critical response to a certain way of understanding and doing law. And scholars such as André van der Walt and Henk Botha also have explored refusal to think about property and constitutionalism in a critical way. So Hornick recalls three ways in which refusal has been invoked in literature, namely Agamben's inoperativity, Cavarero's inclination, and Hartman's fabulation. She rereads each of these then also with another theorist to substantiate her argument for a return to the city for a politics of transformation. Agamben's inoperativity is read with Butler's idea of assembly, Cavarero's with Ahmed, and Hartman's with Hartman's fabulation with Arendt. Hornick's refusal is based on a feminist rereading and reinterpretation, retelling of, as I said, the story of the Bacchae, which tells the story of Dionysius coming to Thebes and the events that unfold when the women of Thebes join the festivities, reject work, leave the city to explore an alternative lifestyle, but later return again to claim the city. And she reads the woman's actions as being part of an arc of refusal, which forms the basis for feminist politics of refusal. And I find this version of refusal that is prepared to take the risk, the impurities of politics on behalf of transformation, a gesture for our reflections on democracy. She identifies feminist politics that shifts from the quest for power to collaborative experiments, from hubris to agency, but notably then also from heterotopia as a space and time of rehearsal and ultimately a return to the city. So important features of the approach are its worldliness, and you see the line hopefully running through my argument, Rose, Arendt now here, and the intention to the politics of storytelling. So let me briefly return to each of these acts of refusal. Agamben, of course, situates his inoperativity, the suspension of use in exceptional liminal spaces associated with festival, exception, and exhibition. The Buckeyes' refusal of work can be read as inoperativity and suspension, but for Honig, it's not only the suspension of use, but its intensification. So instead of Agamben's exhibition and spectacle associated with the male gaze, we find that the Buckeyes' refusal a different inoperativity. The Buckeyes' refusal presents us with a new sociability, a new use in common, new ways of being. Honig recalls an account of feminists who wanted to partake in a strike in support of not one woman less, but who were also involved in cooking food in a soup kitchen. So faced with the dilemma of we want to strike, but we can't strike, the women made the decision to provide raw food. So what happened here is then described as an evaluation of the sensible qualities of things, which for me recalls Jacques Rancière's notion of the redistribution of the sensible. The Buckeyes' new ways of being also brings a new sense of time, a slow tempo of transcendence that refuse by intensifying everyday normativity and that makes alternatives imaginable. Instead of an ethics or politics of pure means, we find a more worldly and an impure agonistic and politics of refusal. And the difference between the Buckeyes' refusal and operativity reminds me here also of critical race scholar Patricia Williams, who, as alternative to the view of certain critical legal studies theorists, being male, and they call to reject rights, refuse rights, make them inoperative, called for rights to be unlocked. Williams's notion of a jurisprudence of generosity is also, I think, an evaluation and ultimately a redistribution of the sensible. Honig comments that Agamben's inoperativity ultimately leaves us with a notion of use that looks very much like the old. It's solitary, not common. It's exhibitive, not experimental. It is an untransformed use. So Cavalera's inclination does not reject use, but rather presents a way to rethink or recover use as care and mutuality. Normativity is not suspended, but reoriented. Cavalera suggests inclination as alternative to rectitude associated with autonomy. She relies on maternalism's gesture of care to suggest a subversive ethics of altruism. Inclination, of course, recalls also feminist work on care and attunement. I'm interested then in linking also inclination with constitutional horizontality. Honig recalls the riddle that the Sphinx gives to Oedipus, which although he manages to solve it, he still misses the lesson that it's trying to teach him, being the wisdom of inclination. And we remember the riddle, what crawls on all fours in the morning, walks on two legs midday, and then in the evening on three. But another lesson coming from the riddle is pluralization and the importance that human life is made up of multiple gestures, none of them essential. And of course, this is for me also an important feature of critical constitutionalism. So Honig reads the main relation of kinship in the Buckeye as one of sorority rather than maternity. And this she combines then with Sara Ahmed's notion of disorientation to shift Cavalera's maternal care and pacifism to sororal love, care, and also violence. And I think the turn to sorority can be fruitfully compared also to Jacques Derrida's lamentation of fraternity as the basis for democracy. Ahmed's disorientation opens up the possibility of gathering differently, of reaching the very limits of social gathering. In her words, to live out politics of disorientation might be to sustain wonder about the very forms of social gathering. The possibility of new social relations and not mere restoration of old ones unfolds. The shift from maternal care and pacifism to sororal agonist politics urges another shift, namely, after the time spent in heterotopia, the return to the city. And this is then where Honig relies on Hartman's fabulation in telling her stories of wayward, which she called them wayward women. So in addition to Arendt's view of the importance of the city and the archive to hold stories of human action, Hartman addresses how the archive holds back the city. Hartman fabulates in order to bring the stories of women whose lives were deemed obscure to the archive. However, Honig notes that Hartman's counter-narratives, she says, are only momentary triumphs, and she's concerned with the question of fabulation and if fabulation can also collectivize or politicize. So she concedes to the slow time of transition, and importantly notable in the story is how Cadmus, Agave's father, who took up the position of king after the death of Pentheus, who was Agave's son, and she kills him, but how Cadmus tries to restore her to her role as wife and mother, to kinship, back into the patriarchal fold. Arendt's distinction between the who and the what comes to the fore here in his denial of who Agave is. She's a huntress, she's a revolutionary leader, and he restores her to a what? A daughter, a wife, and a mother. And by doing this, he relocates her, he dismembers and reassembles her. She's repatriated to patriarchy. So he restores her to his sensibility. He kills the world that she created in order to make her legible to him. And I have a quote here from Honig that I won't read in full because I'm running out of time, but she shows how, she says how the conventional center holds on to power in the face of such challenges when they come home. So what I mentioned in the paper here is also the significance of the splendidness of the failure. And here Honig invokes the Boy's notion of a splendid failure that itself can have the power to generate new readings. She mentions the importance of the role of the chorus in the Bacchae, and the significance of the women joining a chorus and forming a collectivity when after they refuse to work and when they flee the city. So for Honig, the women wanted to establish equality in the city, not only outside the city in an exceptional moment. So she says, were the women successfully to claim the right to the city, the effect would have been a repartitioning of the sensible. They were not, but Honig argues, and I agree, this is not a reason to not to try. So I end here with a quote, actually bringing the story to South Africa, referring to Manete, one of the figures in Nyabulu Ndebere's The Cry of Winnie Mandela, who's of course the figure of refusal in his novel. And Witta writes, perhaps her refusal is an appropriate metaphor: serene detachment, quiet observation, resisting being enthralled by the monumental edifices of post-apartheid constitutionalism, remaining at a critical distance, resisting the temptation to plan, to devise a strategy, but very importantly also remaining alive to the possibility that things could be different. So to wrap up my last second, aesthetics, city life, refusal, the off-modern are ways in which we can hold on to complexity in the face of the functionality and banality of plans, programs, and solutions in order to disclose a different sensibility that might slow us down, that will urge us to take a step back and even retreat for a while, but also always to return. Thank you.
Hello, Prof. Wow. I was a bit delayed because my pen is writing and I'm trying to capture everything on my side. But it was so informative and such a different view of looking at our classical understanding of these monuments and what they are, moving through the Rhodes Must Fall period, where the call to remove and the rethinking of the archive itself and what is in the archive, what is omitted from it. And I think these readings really they help and assist in the thinking. I think there's another, okay, let me not take up the time. I will have time for engagement where I can ask a question, but I think let me quickly just add the points that have been coming up into the commenting section over here. I want to welcome the colleagues to just, if they want to drop a note or a comment or a question and answer, the platform is open. Prof. Andre Kiet writes that refusal has been key to notions of Black fugitivity, and especially as a way of thinking the transformation of higher education as refusing the university. That is, refusing the colonial modes by which the university exists. Is this not perhaps a way by which we should approach constitutional democracy, refusing the colonial template in which it is engraved? Thoughts, Prof?
Yes, thank you. No, I absolutely agree with that. I think that's my think here. So, but it's and we see that kind of refusal coming to the fore in many of the discussions on the Constitution. But I suppose what I'm wondering about is, the refusal that I'm trying to set up here is absolutely the refusal of the reference here, the colonial templates in which it is engraved. But what is happening at the moment, and we have a strong group of scholars arguing for the Constitution to be abolished, and I suppose I wonder if that abolishment can be read as the kind of refusal that I'm talking about, or whether that is closer to maybe Agamben's inoperativity. So I think why I'm intrigued in how some of the theorists here rely on refusal is that it's a refusal that is not a total negation. So it is a refusal that returns to the city. So in that way, I'm returning to the Constitution, and I'm exploring. I'm trying to refuse exactly those colonial bits, the colonial epistemologies. But for me, it's not the kind of refusal that leaves us with the kind of Agamben's inoperativity.
Okay, the floor is open, colleagues. Any more comments? I see there's another comment by Prof. Christie, who writes, how do you read Freedom Park next to the Voortrekkers Monument? The letter is an example of an assertion of modernization of the Afrikaner, an example of a claiming of modernity, and an attempt to create the singular master narrative of Afrikaner nationalism as truth. In contrast, Freedom Park next door can't be seen from afar except at night, which is quite the opposite of the monumental celebration typical of modernity. But the Voortrekker Monument clocks much higher attendance rate than the Freedom Park. Is this the nostalgia that you speak of? This hearkening after the master narrative of truth? Is Freedom Park a monument or a memorial? It contains a memorial wall for anti-apartheid fighters. What does it say about constitutional promise of freedom?
Thank you. Yes, a porous question with many parts and many possibilities. But let me try and take it step for step. I think absolutely the Voortrekker Monument stands in that celebration of a certain kind of modernity. And in that sense, definitely, I will link it to restorative nostalgia, and probably also then intentional monumentalism. There was a certain reason why that monument was created, as probably already then a way to protect and what was perceived as a threat to Afrikanerdom and all those things. So I think that's true. I love Freedom Park. When I was still living in Pretoria, I visited it often, and I read it, I feel it as a memorial. But then interesting, why is it that people still flock to the one and don't go that often to the other one? And it probably says something about the extent to which many people like certainty. I mean, most people don't like how I treat law, because for them the law must be certain. Many people don't like the Constitutional Court because for them a court must symbolize a certain sort of power and force, and they would say, what is this? Law is not aesthetic. Law is not an art museum. And I think in terms of history, there's a lot of certainty and security, of course, false certainty and false security in grand narratives. So the question, what does it say about the constitutional promise of freedom? I mean, I think it probably says something about some of these discussions or debates, or sometimes harsh fights about how rights should be interpreted. And I referred to, the history of a certain legal science that initially didn't want to allow rights. Rights was seen as, the devil, and there was this distinction. So of course, when we talk about public law, human rights, we can have rights, but there was really an attempt to keep sort of the bastions of capitalism, of private law intact. So initially the arguments, when we interpret property or contract and so on, the Constitution should not come into play. Of course, those fights were lost, and it's clear in the Constitution that the common law and all those so-called privately owned rights or so-called private law is open to be transformed and developed by the Constitution. Whether it's happening, of course, that's a different question. But I think even in terms of freedom, how freedom should be interpreted is contested. So in even some of the early Constitutional Court cases, we still had the court leaving us with a very much traditional liberal notion of negative freedom. Although I think many constitutional scholars will criticize that and say that the kind of freedom or the right to freedom imbued in the Constitution holds the potential to be interpreted as something entirely different. So for me, the idea of a public understanding of rights, and also how we interpret freedom in that way. And here maybe Young's distinction between empowerment and autonomy is also important. So it's not a freedom that can be asserted as my own private individual freedom, but this notion of a public freedom. Yeah, I hope I'm getting to at least some of the response to the question. Thanks.
No, Prof. You're doing a good job. And the comments are just flocking in here. Another one from Andres Besaidenote. Karin, I know you are using the city here as a metaphor for a country, as political entity, but I'm trying to find a way to think about your take and Mamdani's argument about apartheid still being alive in rural South Africa in the reconstruction or reconstitution of the homelands, also as legal entities structured around customary law. Would off-modern politics be a way into this question?
Yes. Hi, Andres. Thank you for that. I mean, I think using the cities is risky, given the division that we see, or to use Mondani's term, that the bifurcation between the rural and the urban, and the extent to which, different sets of law apply. And I mean, I don't know if it's helpful, but to at least, and that's maybe also part of the contestation. So on the one hand, we can say the Constitution did not neglect customary law. Under apartheid, customary law was always treated as a secondary law and sort of negated. Now, under the Constitution, the customary law has equal status to common law. Common law is not elevated anymore, at least in theory. But all right, what happens? And of course, there's a certain resistance also to the idea that the customary law should be developed in light of the Constitution, because that might be seen, or is seen as just a continuation of a Western sort of epistemic violence on customary law. Of course, others would have argued that customary law was always a dynamic, flexible system, and that maybe it has developed, and maybe in some instances it's more progressive than the Constitution. I mean, closer investigation will have to be done there. But your question on off-modern, I think absolutely that's where I'm trying to go. How can a sort of an off-modern approach be used to tackle some of these questions, because it is a break with sort of your traditional modern Western position, but it's I think it stands in the almost in the guise of Lyotard's also recognition of the different, and it understands the extent to which in customary law quite often there is not a voice within the guise or the realm of Western law. So I think off modern, working with history and the present, but troubling clear divisions between the past and the present, is most definitely something to develop. The off modern, as Boehm mentions it, but as I say, I think Gillian Rose in a beautiful book titled "Mourning Becomes the Law," where she's really very critical to a certain sort of postmodern embrace of ethics as passivity, I think is useful, and I would read at least some of the work of and insights of a philosopher like Hannah Arendt, also within this tradition of modern. So definitely potential there. I haven't fully developed it, so I can't tell you how it will look like, but definitely I think that's where I would like to go, and I think something to be explored.
Prof. Kiet furthers the conversation here, and he writes, I find the distinction between refusal and abolition productive. Thanks, Karin. One has to be careful, though, that refusal does not lose its transformative radicality.
Yes, thank you for that. Absolutely, I agree, and that's why maybe just to bring it back to the texts, Cavarero's inclination as refusal is maybe one that is too peaceful, leaving it within the sort of maternal realm. And I think what Hanif does is to read it together with this idea of disorientation, and to bring the maternal inclination also to a sorority, and even a kind of violence. If we take the story of the Baka as our starting point, the women are violent. They kill the king. So it's not sort of a maternal love. It's a resistance. So absolutely, I agree with you that refusal would not leave that transformative potential. I'm just going to switch on the light where I'm sitting.
Okay, no problem. Colleagues, we are reaching the midway point of our question and answer. There's one question and answer still to cover, so I invite you to populate with some more. But Prof, before we move on to the next question, I wanted to probe on the issue of the public space. If we look at the city, as you're referring to country, etc., in the guise of the Constitution, what happens then if we enter the online space? So where constitutionality is discussed, I frequent TikTok. I'm a frequent TikToker, and a lot of legality around constitution in South Africa, and as well now as America, a lot of that comes up on the feed. And I wonder, how does that inform us as the public when we think about our own constitutionality, when we engage with these other constitutions that are coming at us, that maybe have better or that maybe do not have, and then that informs how we then interpret our own constitution as a public. Do you think there's connotations or flows in do they flow into each other, or can such a thinking exist just by itself?
So I'm trying to understand exactly what you are asking, but you are of a online space as a public in the first place.
Yes.
Yes. Well, it's I can give you two responses, but I won't give you the sort of the one that someone with grey like myself will give. I have much difficulty with online, and I should have started my paper by saying I wish I were standing in your city presenting this paper. But at the same time, of course, if it weren't for this platform, we all would have probably turned to very problematic private lives since, at least in South Africa, March last. So no, I definitely think that virtual space or online has the of becoming a public, and I think becoming is maybe important here. So I think like also the material public sphere. It's a constant becoming. So sometimes it will fail, sometimes it will work, and we'll have to return to it to see how it can work. I've never been on TikTok, but I know about TikTok. I have a young daughter. So and I'm trying to do something. I'm thinking about within constitutional scholarship, the difference between whether the power is constituted in the Constitution or whether we work with the notion of constituent power in the Constitution. And of course, if it's constituted power, it's final, it's closed off. Where if we can read the Constitution or the constitutional project as protecting only it's ongoing, it's becoming, it's and then there's a possibility of transforming. And I think if what we have online or in this virtual space can be read as constituent, it can play an important role to inform. But again, it's not the finality or grand final narrative. Yeah.
Thank you, Prof. There's another comment in the question and answer section which reads, "Thank you for an informative talk, Prof. Van Marle. Can you please elaborate on examples of where restorative nostalgia and or reflective nostalgia work or don't work?"
So the easiest example would be example where if we take something like the Voortrekker Monument as an example of restorative nostalgia. So the question is, what would it mean for something to work or not to work? So if I read it through, I suppose, a transformative lens, then it will only work if it can bring about movement, if it can bring about the possibility of things to be different. But I have previously invoked this distinction also within the context of a case that was about a specific, the Bapering community, who the community was forcibly removed from land, and it ended up in court because parts of the community wanted to have their land back. But there was also a conflict within the community, because a certain part of the community wanted that specific spot of land back, where others wanted monetary remuneration. Others, because the community was forcibly removed to a different space, and others were happy in the space. They managed to build a new life. Maybe happy is too clear, but they managed to so they wanted, again, support, compensation, so that they can create a new world. And I mean, it's not definite to see the one is correct, the other one is incorrect, but there clearly one could see how a certain hold onto a restorativeness, trying to restore what was, and sometimes restore what was never, that, and how it differed from a more reflective take. So I think, importantly, that never the clear-cut distinction, and the one will always lap into the other. But I do think we can use it to look at things like monuments and museums or spaces. But as I say, there I employed it to give to a case that was about land reform and what the community wanted.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Colleagues, we are entering the last few minutes of this engagement. There are no other questions. Prof, would you like to have some closing remarks? I am talking too soon. I'm talking too soon. There is a question. The Constitutional Court also seems to function as a memorial rather than a monument. I think the notion of the labyrinth is useful to make sense of the space around corners, and in the nooks and crannies, one is led back over and again to remember the horrors of apartheid. Is this then an inadvertent confirmation of the law as indefinitely not yet, while the presence of a past looming over all? Jump to the removal of road statues. Is this why the plinth remains empty ever since? And that question was by Prof. Christie.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. So I think that was the attempt in the building of the court, that in the choice of site. You'll remember that there were many possible sites, and it was decided at the end to have it there at the old fort, because of the historical significance, the layeredness of the palimpsestic nature, but also in the building and the as you know, the reference to a labyrinth, and I suppose the monumental and memorial moment. So I think it's never only memorial. There are the monumental moments, and I think also in law, when we set up law, and as a critical scholar, I see law as indeterminate. I will quite often, when people want to abolish the Constitution, say, well, the Constitution is the obstacle in the way of change. I'll say the Constitution is nothing. It's a piece of paper. So, but at the same time, of course, there are also monumental moments in the Constitution. But the point is maybe also that the law has force. The law has force. When the law cuts, when her decision, it quite often is a lots have been written about the violence of the legal decision. So I think it's not to say that law is now memorial and law is about stories and narrative. Just brings good. Law is false, and as we should also have. But the shift to statues, and I've done some work on the road statues and the importance of the plinth, and we've seen this in many other places also. And that's always the decision. In some cases, they've removed statues, like the roads one. In other, you remember after George Floyd, after in the light of also of Black Lives Matter, many statues have been removed, and in the US, in the UK, others have been transformed to the extent that you can't even recognize them, So that's a different way of dealing with it. But the plinth and this idea of the empty plinth really significant. At the university where I work, there's of course, we also had the statue of President Steyn that was removed, and during the protest, the students themselves removed C.R. Swart, who was standing in front of the law, and that site. So they stand on the university as the Red Square, the Way Plane, and that site now is being developed also as a site of conscience. I would call it, and as a sort of a space where there's the possibility of nostalgias, but definitely a memorial space. So maybe just the reference there to the indefinitely not yet. I mean, I think that's true for what the law can offer, and at that stage, it's true also for what universities can. And one would hope, I suppose, during the time of protests, quite often, I think some of us felt that the doors of learning are closed, or like the door of the law, this door is just never open for certain students to enter. And even where it enters, it's still closed. And so I think this idea of the indefinitely not yet is not only true for the law, and for public spaces, but definitely also for the university as a public space, and for us to keep on refusing, the tendencies and hoping for change. Yeah.
Okay, Prof. We are entering our last 2 minutes of the session, but I want to be lawful, but I also want to offer opportunity. And there's a final question here, Prof, that I think maybe you would like to respond to. So it reads, Prof, to what extent do you think that the inaccessibility of public memorials constructed post-apartheid contribute to the inability to cross the metaphorical bridge envisioned during the transition?
So I wonder what is meant with the inaccessibility. I don't know if someone maybe can elaborate in the chat box. And I know we're running out of time, but so inaccessibility could mean the extent to which they are maybe not always open, always there for the public to access, but maybe it could also refer to the lack of public memorials, and that we need more. But let me take it, if I take it that if public memorials are inaccessible, I do think that definitely it will play a role in as a nation, we're not crossing this bridge. I think coming out of a specific apartheid context, and of course there's also a difference between how whites lived and how Black people lived, because I think whites had this life of isolation behind walls, trying to protect themselves, where of course in areas, in townships, there's a different kind of openness always, I think. But I think in the possibility, the attempt to create a new public is spaces where everyone living in South Africa can be together. But useful here is, the difference between living under a different law, but living differently under the law. And I think there was a specific court case, my name now, that where Justice Froneman played with this distinction. So what is important, I think, for us to cross this bridge is not only the extent to which there's a new constitutional text, or the extent to which there was a shift in the mid-90s, but the question is the extent to which we all live differently under the law, and the hope that we can live even more differently, and not repeat the sameness.
Okay, Prof. I think you covered, because the person did respond by saying the inaccessibility in the sense of memorials being gated either physically or through payment, and then they refer to the Solomon Mahlangu, Mamelodi, and the Freedom Park memorial site.
Yeah, all right. No, I mean, I think there's, as I understand, on all public holidays, they're open to the public. That's the one day that you can go in for free. But it's true. To what extent shouldn't they, always be free? At least, I mean, take school children and students and make it part of a public, education, I suppose. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Prof. I have a lot to chew on going away from here. I'm also very thankful that I could moderate the session with you. So thank you for joining us, ladies and gentlemen. I'm not sure if one of the organizers will come up, but I think we are calling the session to a close then.
Thank you. Thank you very much to you and everyone for questions.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you, Nehemiah, for stepping in. Much appreciated. And of course to Karin for a really wonderful and very powerful address today. Much to work through, and very much appreciated. And I want to also tell people to please join us tomorrow morning at 8:45, when we will have our first morning session, a plenary on constitutionalism, land and securitization in response to COVID-19. So hope to see you there. Thank you very much, and thank you to our audience.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.